It's been a good little trip down memory lane. Today, I hope to be able to talk a little bit about podcasting, a little bit about entrepreneurship, both subjects that are near and dear to my heart. But I want to start off talking a little bit about knowledge and wisdom, and hopefully start off with a little bit of a profound statement. Anybody know the difference between knowledge and wisdom? Okay, fine. I've got a good story for it. Knowledge is knowing that tomatoes are a fruit, and wisdom is knowing not to put tomatoes into fruit salad. That's a good way to start out. And you can see I'm not exactly the most entertaining person in the world. My jokes don't always resonate super well, and you're going to, by the end of this, be wondering, how in the world does a guy like this run a successful podcast? Well, I know my strengths and I know my weaknesses, and I think that's something really critical in the business world, especially the knowing your strengths, and that's knowing them's knowledge, actually being able to overcome them or to find a way to get past your weaknesses. That's real true wisdom, and you'll see in the podcasting realm, I've done a pretty good job of doing that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as time goes on. Now that I've done my little entertainment speech, the rest of the podcast is just going to go downhill, or the rest of the show is going to go downhill from here. You've hit the high note already. Bryce introduced me just a little bit. Oh, now my clicker's not working. We tested this before. It was all working before. But Monty, you might need to help me. The next slide. It's not working for you either.
Okay, exit and then get back into the display mode.
So what we'll do is we will, there we go. We can at least maybe get to the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about my timeline and my history. I think this is really relevant. The main focus of the podcast, or this presentation, is going to be on the podcast. But in reality, kind of my business history really is going to set a foundation for what I want to talk about the podcast, and make things make more sense. So as Bryce mentioned, I kind of got my feet in the industry of the trucking industry, working for Flying J. I worked for them for 5 years. There was a brief period I went somewhere else for a little bit of period of time. But in 2010, I saw an opportunity to buy a business. It was owned by two older brothers that were wanting to retire. I'd always wanted to be an entrepreneur, as Bryce said, from back early when I was a bit younger. And this opportunity kind of came about, and I decided, my dad and I bought Motor Carrier HQ. Back in that day, it was called Progressive Reporting Agency. We've kind of rebranded since, because nobody knows what a reporting agency is, even in the trucking industry anymore. So that was back in 2010. Life kind of went on a little bit, and I'm in the National Guard as well. And life threw me a curveball in 2012, and I found out I was going to get deployed. And as a business owner, that's a really scary thing. We'd only been in the business for about a year and a half. My dad had really just been a silent partner on the business. At that point, we had, for the first year, it was me and one other employee, but by the time I got the deployment orders, there were about, I think, 3 or 4 of us in the business. My dad was kind of semi-retired, doing other things. He didn't really have anything to do with the day-to-day business at that point. To make a long story short, I deployed. My dad kind of came in and helped manage things and oversee things a little bit while I was gone, but we had some key employees that really kind of stepped up, took the bull by the horns, and really made things function while I was gone. And then when I came back, I didn't have anything to do in the business. The employees were kind of handling everything. It was kind of funny. The employees had said that when I left, everybody had a Chris addiction. They always wanted to do everything with Chris. But by the time I got back, that Chris addiction had gone to an Ariel and Tyler addiction. And clients didn't want to have anything to do with me anymore. And what that did, and this is really huge, it allowed me to focus on the business instead of working in the business. And that's probably something that you hear quite often from, business mentors and people that have been around a long time is if you want to be able to run a successful business and you want to be able to grow that business, you've got to spend a vast amount of your time working on the growth, on the business, making the business better, and not doing the day-to-day operations of the business. We're going to get back to that lesson a little bit later on, kind of as I go through this history, when we start talking about the podcast a little bit more. But keep that in the back of your mind. Then in 2015, I went through the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Business Program. It was a really good opportunity. I learned a lot. It kind of built off my foundation of my business management that I learned in college. It kind of refreshed a few things. But one of the biggest things that comes out of the Goldman Sachs program is you build a growth plan. And that growth plan is really designed to help you grow your business. Well, at this point in my career, I've been with Motor Carrier HQ. We've been going for 5 years at that point, roughly. And I'd seen my clients come in. One of the big things we did is we'd help truck drivers that want to start their own business kind of go through the whole startup process, help get in compliance with all the DOT regulations, the Department of Transportation regulations. And we'd see clients do that, and we'd see some of them have great success, and we'd see others fail and not have great success. And that really started my mind thinking, and I started working on the business and trying to find ways that we could provide different services to our clients that would help them with their businesses. And that's how a lot of these other businesses kind of came about. I Thrive Funding, we do accounts receivable financing. A lot of guys struggle with operational cash. Factoring is another term for it. And it's really common in the trucking industry, but there's a lot of, for lack of a better term, snakes in the grass in the factoring world, guys that take advantage of owner-operators. And I've been exposed to that when I worked at Flying J. So I went to talk to a couple guys I'd worked with there. To make a long story short, we decided to partner up together, figured we could do a factoring company. Clients were going to use that service. We could help them. We could do it honestly, ethically, make a little money at it and make a better experience for them. So we started that in 2013. Tracking Assets is a little accounting firm that focuses on the trucking industry, helping our clients with financials. But kind of back to that growth plan with Goldman Sachs. As I was looking and seeing these clients come in and out of business, some of them do well, some of them not succeed, I started to think, well, what can we do to help our clients be more successful on the business end? And what we realized was that most of our clients, they've driven trucks, they knew how to get loads from point A to point B. It's a lot more difficult than you would think, but they knew the mechanics of it. But most of them had never been exposed to the operational side of things, let alone how to actually run and function as a business, and what habits you need to have, what skills you need to develop, and that kind of thing. So I started thinking about it, well, how can I help my clients do this? And that's really in this growth plan that I'm developing with the Goldman Sachs program. I'm starting to think through that. What do I do? And it dawned on me, you know what? I was listening to a podcast about a podcaster that kind of did something similar to what I was wanting to do, but in the podcast realm rather than the trucking industry. And I started to think I can do this in trucking. And what that basically was is I decided to start a trucking company and document the entire process with a podcast. And I just kind of developed that plan with the Goldman Sachs. My growth plan was a big chunk of it was, I'll build this podcast. I'll show my clients how to run a business. Because at this point I had a pretty decent amount of business experience. I knew what I was doing business-wise, but I'd never actually run a trucking company. I'd been in the industry for 10 years at that point. I'd seen it happen, but I'd never done it. So I decided to kind of take my business acumen, use that, and build a podcast. So let's go ahead. Can we play that video? I've got a video that kind of promotes the podcast and talks a little bit about the podcast. We're going to show that really quick. For those of you that are watching from home, if you can't see it for some reason, if you just go onto YouTube and Google Holland Assets podcast. You'll see at some point, you'll see one, we've got a lot of videos on there, but you'll see one kind of with me in front of a green truck. It's a 2-minute video. That's kind of what we're looking for.
Right. Okay, go ahead. In my first year as an owner-operator, I grossed over $200,000. Of that, I paid myself $44,587 as the driver, and on top of that, I made another $32,204 of profit. I documented my entire experience through my podcast, Holland Assets. I'm a complete open book. I show everything from the good to the bad, and I even share my detailed monthly financial statements so you can see all the money coming in, along with all the money going out. I also talk about some of the challenges that I faced that prevented me from making even more money. You may ask yourself, why am I doing this? It's because I've seen thousands of my clients at Motor Carrier HQ start their own trucking companies. And while many of them have found great success, others have struggled. And over the years, I've seen many great truck drivers fail because they don't understand how to apply basic business principles. And oftentimes, they've never even seen what goes on behind the scenes to keep the wheels turning. So I decided to take my 15 plus years of experience owning multiple businesses, both inside and outside the trucking industry, on the road, so that I can show people the process of starting and running their own successful trucking company. Not one of my previous companies was an actual trucking company. I'd never owned a truck. I'd never hauled a load. In fact, I had to go get my CDL to make this whole thing happen. What I did know was how to run a successful business. Take your trucking experience, combine it with my business plan, and you should be able to make as much or more money than I have. If you've ever thought about becoming an owner-operator, there is no reason you can't take the blueprint I've outlined in my podcast and follow it and become more successful than I was, because you have more driving experience than I did, and you'll be able to learn from the mistakes I made. Check out the Holland Assets podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and go to our website at hollandassetsllc.com.
All right, who's ready to go start a trucking company? All right, so when I built the growth plan with Goldman Sachs, as I said, the podcast piece was a big part of that. And that was in the beginning of 2015. And I wasn't planning, part of my growth plan did not involve me going out and driving a semi-truck. That kind of evolved over time. And I was really scared at the beginning to do the podcast because I'd never podcasted. I didn't know what I was doing. I knew I wasn't, I'm not the most entertaining person in the world. I'm pretty dry. And so I knew it was going to be a big commitment, and I had a million other things going on, and I just couldn't enact that growth plan. Finally, fast forward almost 4 years, well, really it was 4 years to the day before the podcast got going, but it was at the end of 2018, so well over 3 years from the time that I finished the Goldman Sachs program before I finally in my mind decided, okay, I'm going to go and do this. And it was a big jump, and I decided, you know what, to really make this work, I'm going to actually go out and get my CDL, and I'm going to drive. And I made the commitment at that point that I was going to drive for an entire year. And so what that meant for me was, and my family, I was on the road for 20 to 25 days a month for that entire year. I was gone all the time. When my wife and I were talking about this, should we really do this? She's all like, well, we've been through a year deployment with the military. This year trucking can't be that bad. Well, it was not easy. There were kind of pros and cons to those 2 different years. There were different experiences, but both of them had definitely had benefits. So that's kind of really how the podcast was born. That started in 2019, about May of 2019, I think, is when we launched our first episode. And we launched 10 episodes right at the very beginning, and then those 10 episodes are really kind of the whole startup process of getting the trucking company up and running. We'll talk a little bit more kind of about the content and what exactly that was as we go on. So next slide.
I'm working on that.
It's not wanting to play?
It's
Well, the
not
next
wanting to
slide's
play.
really boring. All it says
That's
is
fine.
the keys to a successful podcast. So what I decided to do, I'm really a podcaster. I'm a business owner that has a podcast that kind of supports the business. And that's really what this presentation is kind of really going to focus on. But with that being said, it's a lot of what I talk about is probably going to be even applicable to somebody who wants to just run a podcast for the sake of a podcast. So one of the things that's really important with the podcast is really to build a foundation. And again, this is kind of where the business side really focuses, or where I'm really going to kind of focus a little bit more on the business side of the podcast. On this next one.
Sorry, I
That's
don't know what's
And
going on.
if you just want to leave it here, that's
Okay.
fine.
I have no idea what's going on with my computer.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So building the foundation. And this is where I kind of want to get back a little bit to, if you're a business owner trying to do a podcast that kind of supports your business in one way or another, you've got to build a foundation. You've got to, because a podcast is a huge investment. It's a huge investment in time. It's a huge investment in money. And how much money depends on how you want to do things. Next slide. So you've got to have your business kind of at a foundation where I think there's no, the one right before that, number 4. Yeah. There's I think a couple things that are really critical with the business. And one, if you're the business owner that's going to be doing a lot of the time with the podcast, you've got to be able to free up some time so that you can dedicate to this podcast. It really takes a lot of time to do an episode. Our episodes usually last anywhere from 20 minutes. We've had some that have been a little bit over an hour, but most of them are probably around the 30-minute time frame. And I probably, especially early on, before I really knew what I was doing, before I kind of developed my content timeline and what the content was, and really while I was inexperienced, I was probably spending at least 5 to 10 hours of my time with each episode that I developed. We also have a website. It's just hollandassetsllc.com is the website of the podcast. And so I did all the show notes. Every time we launched an episode, we'd have show notes with it. We try to put some really relevant content in there, a lot of different things. So I think it's like $80 mic.
Yeah.
It's not expensive. So don't do that. So yeah, it's not wanting to advance again. So I've got this really cool animation that, there you go, there it went, see? No equipment, don't worry about that. Don't get hung up on the equipment. You're clicking better than I am, so maybe just,
I don't know what's wrong.
okay, let's try, maybe just exit out and go on to the next slide.
Okay.
All right, we'll talk a little bit about content. And this is what I think, like, I talk about the keys to a successful podcast. All these other things are probably like 80% of it. The content is really, or the other things are 20%, the content's really 80. If you get the content right and you know your target market, your podcast is gonna do well. And I think that's one of the things that we've done really well. I'm like a niche within a niche. You know, I'm in the trucking industry, I'm podcasting, mostly to guys who wanna start a trucking company. And so it's not like I'm starting off with a really, really huge audience. But we get about, I mean, these aren't crazy huge numbers. I'm not going viral or anything, but we get about 18,000 listens or a month on the podcast. I mean, it's a pretty decent audience. And I think the reason behind that is because of the content. And you can see that. I love reading through people's comments, like when they give us a rating on iTunes or they rate us on Facebook or somewhere else. It just hits the target market really well. This is the kind of stuff they really want. John.
So outside of just producing the podcast, you get a lot of questions and comments. How much time does that take?
I probably spend between half an hour to an hour a week, probably closer to an hour. We're either responding to comments on Facebook or replying to emails. I tell people they can email me too. And so, yeah, I spend a decent amount of time on that as well. But it's good. You're building your audience and you get a bunch of fans that share it, that like the content, and it really moves on. Let's see if we can get, I've got another couple cool animations in here. So first one, you want your audience to consume it and to, consume, not just want to nibble at your content. You want to build content that people are clamoring for. When I first launched the podcast for the first year while I was on the road, I was launching an episode every week. And then I changed once I got home and got off the road. I just kind of felt with the pace of life and being able to put good content out, I decided to cut that back to every other week. And I still, even to this day, on the off weeks, when I don't launch an episode, people will send me little angry notes or kind of joking angry notes. Hey, we want an episode. Where's the episode? They really, really like the content. And if you want your podcast to work, I can't emphasize this enough. They want to, you've got to have clients or listeners that want to consume it, not just nibble and dabble in it. They want to devour it. It's got to be really good content. So how do you go about making really good content, especially when you're a guy like Chris Vernon that's really dry and not entertaining, not really fun to listen to? Back in 2018, when I finally decided, hey, I'm going to do this, I started listening to more podcasts. I just started searching, in Utah, who podcasts out of Utah. I can't remember exactly what I was searching for, but basically that. And I started listening to some podcasts that were based out of Utah. And I listened to one, it's called the Legendarium Podcast. And the main host is Craig Hanks. And I actually listened to two of them that I really liked. His was one of them. I can't even remember what the other one is. And I reached out to both of them. There was contact information on their websites, Facebook. And Craig was the only one that responded back to me. The other person didn't even respond back. And so I started a dialogue with Craig. Hey, I'm thinking about starting a podcast. I want to do this. Is this something you'd be interested in helping me with? And you know what? I'd actually reached out to 3, and 2 of them wouldn't even give me the time of day. One of them was a big, is somebody you guys would recognize. I had kind of a little connection with him, and he didn't really want to do anything with me. The other one didn't respond, and then Craig did. And one thing that I found kind of through this whole process is that people that actually have a successful podcast, and you say, hey, I want you to help me do a podcast, they get that question all the time. So if you want to go the route that I did, where you get somebody to help you out, you've got to like go with a business plan and like show them that like you're legit serious about this, or they're just not going to give you the time of day. So anyway, Craig, the thing that I liked about him was he had either guests on the podcast that he was doing, or he usually actually had some co-hosts too. And I really liked the banter between Craig and the other co-hosts. And the podcast itself is, again, it's kind of a niche within a niche. He's a huge fantasy book fan, some sci-fi type stuff. And they basically, for the most part, just talk about that. They rate books, they bring authors on. And so it's not my cup of tea, really. But I just really liked how he entertained people. And so I reached out to him, and to make a long story short, he could do all the editing. He actually has a podcast studio, a shed that's in his backyard that he converted to a studio with lots of equipment in it. And so I do pay him to both co-host and to do the editing, but it's worked really well because he's a great interviewer, he's funny, and he brings an entertainment aspect to the podcast. That's my weakness. And I realized that if this podcast was going to work, it not only had to be informative, but it had to have at least a little bit of entertainment value. And so that's the hole that Craig filled in my weakness. And it's worked out really, really well. People like it. They love Craig. They love the entertainment value that he brings. He knows nothing about trucking other than what he's learned over the last 2 years doing this podcast together. So I think that's really important. Is one, you've got to have some good entertainment value, and two, you've got to provide some really good information. And we've kind of, over the last couple of years, we've developed what I would say is a pretty good format to our podcasts. Typically, the podcasts start out with kind of an intro, and that intro involves, especially early on when I was driving, we talk about an experience I had on the road. Whether it was something really funny that happened to me, a stupid rookie mistake that I made as a truck driver, because I'm talking to this audience that most of these guys have probably been driving trucks for 2 to 20 years, and they get a kick out of me, a little self-deprivation, making fun of myself, doing stupid things on the road. We talk about those kind of things, and now where I'm not driving, we'll talk about experiences that our drivers have. We've grown the trucking business, so the trucking company has 4 trucks right now, so that gives us some good ammunition for that kind of intro piece. Then the podcast will have like a main topic that we talk about. One of the things that's really people like about this podcast is we're incredibly transparent. I show the good, the bad, the ugly of my entire experience, from me driving, the frustrations, the entrepreneurship, owning businesses is stressful. It's hard. It's not easy. We talk a lot about that. But then we also, we show the financials. I'm a complete open book. I show how much money we've got coming in, what all our expenses are. We've basically built a blueprint that people can follow as we've built this content. The early on, so every month I do an episode on the profit loss statements of the company. We'll talk about what went well, what went wrong, what are some of the things that we're noticing in the profit and loss statements. And then I post those on the website in the show notes so that people can go in and look at them. But then, we talk about kind of some of this content early on. It's the only place guys can really go out and see how to start a trucking company, what my startup costs were. We talk about buying semi trucks and what you kind of want to look for. This to some people may seem like common sense, but most truck drivers, when they go and they want to start a trucking company, their dream is to go buy a flat nose Pete semi. It's like the Harley Davidsons of the semi-truck world. They're the coolest trucks. They're kind of loud. They look cool. Guys will chrome them all out. Well, the problem with that is those things get like 5 miles to the gallon, and you're competing with guys that are driving trucks that are getting 7 or 8 miles to the gallon. So we talk about those kind of principles. We talk about understanding your variable costs and your fixed costs. What's the difference? How do you use those in making decisions on what kind of loads you should take? Based off of what area of the country you're in, what kind of freight should you seek? Just all these kind of step-by-step instructions of how to start and run a trucking company. And that's really what has built this content that has made fans out of our listeners, because we show them everything, and it's detailed, and it's relevant to what they want to do with their businesses. And they just really, really like it. And it's gotten to the point where those folks want to consume it, and they get mad at me if I don't do an episode. Like I again, in the National Guard 2 or 3 weeks ago, well, about a month ago, life was really busy. Things were crazy. I didn't get as far down, and I had to pre-do an episode because I was going to Morocco for the military for a week, and I just could not get everything done before I left. So Craig and I found a way for me to record the podcast episode while I was sitting in my hotel in Morocco, because if I didn't do that, I'd have a bunch of angry people wondering why I'd gone so long without an episode. That's the kind of fan base that you want to develop, and that's done through really good content. Another thing that you need to keep in mind, though, too, and I hear this from a lot of podcasters, and I see this creep into my world a little bit. It's something that you call podcaster fatigue. Coming up with an episode, and I'm only doing it every other week at this point, but it is still sometimes really hard to motivate myself to go and spend the time that it takes to develop the good content to be able to launch an episode even every other week. So if you're thinking about doing this, that's one thing that you want to keep in mind. If you're thinking about, hey, I'm going to do a podcast episode every day, people that have done that for the most part that I've seen, unless that's their sole focus, and even if it is your sole focus, it gets very fatiguing to have to do that. It's not easy. So keep that in mind. I'm not saying you can't do it, but just keep in mind it can be hard. All right, next slide. All right, so now we're going to talk, or actually before I go to the next slide, anybody have any questions on content? Okay.
How much time do you spend prepping typically for one episode?
So that's that 5 to 10 hours. Before it's done? Yeah, so the recording doesn't take very long. That's the prep work. Like trying to figure out what I want to say, building an outline or building a script. There are a handful of times, probably we've done 83 episodes, I think, at this point, and I've probably had guests on somewhere between 10 and 20 of those episodes. And so figuring out what questions we want to ask, prepping the guests. But when we sit down to actually record, this is where we're probably a little bit more raw. Like we do minimal editing. So if we're doing an hour-long podcast, we probably have recorded for 1 hour and 5 minutes to maybe 1 hour and 10 minutes. And half the time that we stop because of the podcast is because his podcast studio is right above the flight line of the jets at Hill Air Force Base. And so we'll have to like pause, wait for the jets to pass, then start recording again. We don't we don't do a whole lot of editing. So most of the time is the prep work. Any other questions? All right. Marketing the podcast. This is another really critical and important piece. Your podcast is not just going to get out into the world and grow by itself. It takes some time and effort. And there's, in my experience, there's kind of 2 ways to do it. You can kind of do a slow organic growth method, or you can do it kind of quick with paid advertising. So want to advance the slide? So these are my two most recent cars that I've owned. I had a Honda Civic that I drove for 17 years, And it's kind of represents my organic growth. It'll get you there, but it's going to take a long time to build your audience and grow it. If you use paid advertising, which we've done some, we don't use a whole ton of it. We don't spend a crazy amount of money on paid advertising, but we've probably spent anywhere from $0 to $1,000 in a month on advertising, trying to grow our audience base just a little bit, trying to just get it out there so people know it. The organic growth is stuff like using social media. I'm not very good at social media, and so that's one thing that has been hard for me. I've got a few employees, and we use an advertising agency for other parts of my business, and they help out a little bit. I've got an employee that helps create some of the social media content. I'll usually come up with the concept, and then somebody else will kind of build it. And then we'll post that onto social media and kind of let it grow. And if you've got that good content, it'll grow its own legs and start to grow. It will get you to a good sized audience eventually, but it may take 5 years to build that. Craig and his Legendarium podcast, he went the organic, almost strictly organic route. And it took him, he said, about 2 years before it really started really gaining a decent audience. And at 5 years, it was like pretty big. In his little realm, in his world, it's a big deal podcast. It's pretty good.
When they get in there, like, where are you trying to drive them to? Is it because you make money off of like the sponsors of the podcast, or like what's the ultimate goal for your podcast?
So I don't have any sponsors. That day may come that I do sponsors, but it's kind of interesting. So for my business, the approach that I've taken is it's a super soft sell. People know that I own these other businesses. We talk a little bit about them, but we probably talked about it, honestly, a little bit early on, more my businesses and kind of how they relate. And we've had a couple episodes that talk about some of the services my businesses provide because they're relevant. Like, for instance, our episode number 3, the 3rd episode of the podcast, talks about getting your DOT number, your motor carrier authority, so that you have the licenses essentially that you need to be able to haul freight legally. That's one of the big things my businesses does. So we talked about that in one podcast episode. We essentially kind of went through when somebody calls our business. I had kind of my sales manager as the guest on that episode, and we basically went through what we go through with somebody when they call the first time and asking those questions and helping out. So people know that my business does that, but we're not like, I don't have ads or ad space in any of the podcasts.
Have you seen a correlation in the uptick in business from that side that's coming from the podcast?
Absolutely. Like I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'll talk about it more in a minute, but more than I would have thought. Just as a funny little bit of a story. So when my wife and I in 2018 were deciding whether we wanted to do this or not, I started to think, you know what, this is either going to be the biggest mistake of my life, the biggest 1 year waste of my life, or it's going to be something really good. And it's turned into something really good. But it could have been a disaster. I was kind of worried about it. Like any business or anything you do, you're taking a lot of risks. But it's been super beneficial. Any other questions on marketing the podcast?
So when you talk about paid advertising, you talk about social media, where your focus is as far as paid advertising?
Paid advertising, most of our paid advertising is through Facebook. That's where my demographic is mostly on, is Facebook. Not a ton of them on Instagram, a little bit on Instagram, but none of the other, they're not really on the other social media platforms. But other industries and other businesses, some of those other platforms would be super valuable.
And how are you, like, what are you advertising? Like, part of an episode, or like, come listen to this podcast, you learn these things, or what is it? Like, what's the message?
So like that intro video that I played is one of our big marketing tools. We'll put that on Facebook so people can watch it. and that gets them interested. So we're really, the thing that we drive people to is the podcast. We don't drive them to any of my other services or anything else that we do. It's strictly to drive them to the podcast. And we just do things that are relevant to trucking, that are relevant to people who want to start their own trucking business, which is really what this podcast is focused on, guys who want to start their own trucking business. And so our marketing and advertising all kind of focuses on that. You get them kind of interested, and then you direct them to the podcast. So, and you either direct them like to iTunes or to Google Play or Stitcher, one of the podcast platforms, or we direct them sometimes straight to our website. And they can listen to the podcast from our website as well.
Have you gotten onto other people's podcasts, like as a guest speaker?
A little bit, but that's actually starting to happen more. And that's one thing I probably haven't done as well as I should, because people tell me all the time that I need to get out and be a guest on other people's podcasts. I've done a little bit of that, like once or twice, but if I could think of one, there's probably several. One of the things that I could do better, that's one. Absolutely, that's important. I just haven't done a very good job. Any other questions on advertising? Okay. So let's talk, we can just leave it here for now. Let's talk a little bit about some of the benefits. So you asked, have I seen a correlation between an uptick in business? Yes, absolutely. And it's been like, I wouldn't say crazy, but it's been a very significant uptick. Like we've seen a significant growth in revenue, but the other thing that's kind of beautiful about it is our actual advertising expenses have gone way down. Like we were spending tens of thousands of dollars a month in advertising before the podcast. We're spending almost nothing now. And the podcast has really kind of helped build our audience. And so if you're familiar with the marketing term organic growth or organic, like organic search engines and versus paid advertising and organic advertising, like we've gone from most of our revenue coming in through paid advertising to almost more than we were getting before, almost all coming in through organic, which is significantly cheaper.
Do you feel like from when you were doing your paid advertising to the clients that you're getting now, they're a lot more loyal now?
Great point, and one of the things I want to talk about. Yes, absolutely. Not only are they more loyal, but they've seen, because of our transparency. Like one of the things I think is really important about our content is we built this podcast not to really benefit our business. We did, but we didn't. Like the focus is to help our clients. The focus is not to build our business. And I think because we do that, and people see that, we're transparent, we show them everything, they can see that. And so they trust us. And so that once somebody that's listened to the podcast, they want to pay us back somehow, because we've given them all this absolutely free content, this free information that's been super beneficial to them, that's helping them out in an important aspect of their life. So they know that one of the ways that they can kind of return the favor is to use our business services to do some of the things they're going to have to pay somebody to do anyway. And so they want to use us. And so when they call in to we call our, for lack of a better term, salespeople, we call them business coaches, because that's really kind of what they're helping our clients do is start a business. They're walking through the process. We kind of help them develop a customized game plan of everything that they need to do. And by the time they call and talk to our people, they already trust us. And so it's a pretty easy sell. It's a pretty easy close, because they know us and they trust us. That's one of the huge benefits of the podcast.
Do you worry about competition at all? Just kind of vulnerable having so much out there for anybody.
Yeah, that was one of my big fears early on, publishing our profit and loss statements, publishing everything. So I'm going to break that question into kind of two answers. Could it potentially be an issue with my trucking company? possibly, but there's, in the trucking industry, it's a really big sea. And we run our business really well. A lot of trucking companies are mismanaged. And because we're using good business principles, I'm not worried about the competition there. Nobody else, there are only a handful of companies across the country that do what we do, as far as helping truck drivers start their own business, helping get in compliance with all the DOT regulations, that kind of thing. I think the benefit that we gain by being transparent and showing them everything far outweighs the potential information we're providing our competitors that they could potentially use against us. And plus, I mean, what we're doing now, I mean, if somebody else wanted to go and replicate this, I mean, it's something that took years to do. I mean, it's not like you can just go out and build 2 years of a trucking company operating's content on day one. I mean, it takes time to build that. So I'm not super worried about it. The benefit far exceeds the potential problems it can cause. Any other questions? One thing that I forgot to talk about that I wanted to mention is, if you want to do a podcast, you really need to have a very long-term perspective on it. You cannot start a podcast and think, okay, I'm going to do this for a month and see how it goes. And most advertising is that way too. You can't, it's just not going to work. In my opinion, I think you have to commit to it for a minimum of 6 months. So whether you're going to launch a couple episodes a week or an episode every other week, you've got to commit to that timeline for, I think, at least 6 months. It took at least 3 months of running our podcast before we started to see like consistent listener growth in the podcast. And even at that point, like at 3 months, I'm still thinking, okay, was this the biggest mistake of my life, or is this going to be a good thing? It probably took a full year before I'm like solid, like, okay, whew, this was a good thing. It takes a while to build a good podcast. At least with my dry sense of humor and my dry personality. Somebody who's more entertaining than me, it may not take that long.
I have a question, and I don't know if this is a weird question, but what do you think of podcast versus video?
That is a really good question. So you think about my demographic, truck drivers.
They're on the road.
They're on the road, sitting down, 11 hours a day driving a semi-truck. They have nothing better to do than listen to the podcast. So that works really well. Well, people have been telling me, like, especially the marketing agency that I use for other aspects of my business, they've been telling me all along, you need to do more video, you need to do more video, you need to put the podcast on video. So we've slowly over time gone back with all the episodes. About 2 months ago, we started video recording all the podcast episodes. So we now launch them on both podcast platforms and YouTube. So people can watch. I don't know why they'd want to watch me talking to Craig, but they can watch that on YouTube. And that audience is growing too. In only 2 months, I mean, we're over 1,000 subscribers, and each video episode's getting about 200 views. So I think that's a good thing to do. So as far as like video of the podcast, I think more and more podcasts are doing that. And I think it's a really valuable thing to do. And it's something that if you've got the means to do it, you should absolutely do it. Craig's got equipment where he essentially records the video, and he's able to really quickly splice everything together, export the audio, and it doesn't take him much more time to do both the audio and the video, launch them both on the separate platforms. It's not like it's not doubling his work by any means. It's pretty easy. We have two questions. Go ahead.
So Susan Lane says, will you be addressing podcast platforms? There's so many platforms, all with varying benefits. Curious to know what you use and like.
Again, that would probably, I wish Craig was here. He could probably answer that question better than I can. But we use, most of our listenership comes through iTunes, so the Apple platform, and Google Play, the Google one. That's probably 80 to 85% of the content. As we've started to do stuff on YouTube, it's taking over a little bit more of the segment. Stitcher gets used a little bit, and I think there's one more. But that's what people listen to. We use a platform where we actually load the episodes to, is called Podbean. And so how Podbean works is you put the episodes on there, and again, Craig does all this. I just know some basics about it, but he uploads the episodes on there, and then there's an RSS feed that basically launches them to all the platforms that we choose. So it's not hard to get on as many platforms as you want. Most of them don't charge or cost money. It's just you set up the RSS feed right, and they just automatically, once you post it on the Podbean, they just automatically get launched out into the various platforms. I hope that answered the question. If not, do a follow-up.
My guess was she's probably referring to a hosting, like.
So Podbean would be,
Buzzsprout.
that's the one we use. It's fairly inexpensive. It's easy to use. When I say, I can't even remember how much you pay for it now, but it's not much. Like, it's negligible.
So I do a podcast as well. I do mine through Buzzsprout, which has been awesome. It's very easy. It's the same thing. It takes just a little bit of work to go and upload it to Buzzsprout. And if you've got the RSS attached to iTunes or Apple Podcasts and all those other ones, it just throws it out to all of them for you. So I'm assuming she's probably
It's
referring
probably
to hosting for that.
So yeah, and I'm sure there's a lot of them that are the same, right? And it's seamless. Once you get it set up, it's pretty easy.
It does it for you.
Yeah. It's basically like uploading a video to YouTube, and then it just goes out. How smooth.
So do you have to pay to be on like the iTunes and the Google Play?
You pay for the hoster, the Podbean or whatever hosting platform you use. And again, it's not very expensive. And then iTunes, all that's free.
The pricing is based on the amount of content that you're putting up, basically. So if you're doing hours and hours and hours of stuff, you're paying more. But for you said you're doing every other week, so 2 episodes a month. Yeah, that's
Even when we're
less
doing-
than $15 a month, probably.
I was gonna say I think it's like 20, but yeah, it's not much. And some of what you pay for too, like at least with Podbean, I think there's different tiers, and it's not just based on solely on how much content you want, but there's like different reporting functions. Like if you want more detailed reporting on your listenership and stuff like that, then you pay a little bit more. But it's not much.
So while we're talking costs, I'm curious, and you can just do a ballpark of what you would pay for editing.
For editing by itself, I think you're roughly looking around $80 an hour. I'd say between 80 and 100. So I think our episodes, I don't pay the bill, my brother does. I think for the most part, we're paying between $200 and $300 an episode. And again, those are all things you can, like, if you've got the time, it's not rocket science. It's stuff you can do on your own. So the biggest reasons that I use Craig, the biggest reason is a good co-host. The second biggest reason is it takes, like, I don't have the time to go in and edit. I didn't want to learn how to do the intricacies of editing. And so it's well worth the $200 to $300 an episode that we pay to have Craig host and do the editing.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of gonna ask, is like how much you paid him and like how you got that arrangement. Was it just that you came with a good business plan and convinced him that?
Yeah, so I like, he said, like, early on over, like, when we were first kind of getting going, he's like, I've had tons of people come to me kind of wanting to start a podcast episode. He's like, you're the first person that has actually come with a plan and outlined, these are the first 10 episodes I want to do. This is what I want to do about, I actually came with like more than just a hope and a dream, right? I had a plan. And that's what makes the difference. Like if you're going to try to use somebody to help you with your podcast, you need to sell yourself to them and show, hey, I'm going to be in this for the long term. And two, here's what I want to do. And here's how I'm going to do it. And I think that's what makes the biggest difference with Craig. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question for you, Chris. So at what point are you able to monetize a podcast? Are you still a little bit before that? Like as far as, are you having commercials or like having someone have paid placement? Are you looking at that yet for the podcasters? Or is there a certain point where you need to still work up to a certain size for that?
There is a size that you need to work up to, and I couldn't tell you exactly what that is. I think that depends a lot on the market. Like we could advertise and get paid advertisers on ours right now. We've got a good enough of a listenership. Plus, on top of that, they're businesses. Like I've had interest from trucking maintenance people, people that provide financing to trucking companies. Because our market are people that are kind of ready to buy what I would say significant services, like financing for a truck, mechanic services on their trucks, fuel cards. If I didn't already own a factoring company, I guarantee I could get a factoring company to advertise on it.
So are you kind of doing kind of like the Larry Miller model where they cross promote their properties within their assets?
Yeah.
Are you starting to do that with your podcast?
So I've kind of done that to a certain extent all along. Like when because factoring, like for instance, factoring is a big topic in the trucking industry. And so naturally we'd have to talk about it in the podcast, the pros and cons of it. And so when we talked about the pros and cons of factoring, even though I own a factoring company, I try to take a really, like I'm not trying to make somebody's decision one way or another. I'm just trying to tell them the pros and cons of using a factoring company versus not using a factoring company. And if they want to use mine, great. And so we do some kind of that cross-selling. I've had my business partners in the factoring industry, when we talk factoring, bring them on because they're really more the experts than I am. So yeah, and that's been a good thing, that cross-selling. Any other questions? Go ahead.
This is interesting because when we were, I was looking
You mentioned you post on YouTube. Do you post on Facebook too, or like those?
The actual episodes?
Yeah.
So every time we launch an episode, we'll do a release where we've got through our website, we've got a form that captures people's email addresses if they want to kind of subscribe to our email list. And over the 2 years, we've got an email list of about almost 40,000 people on it. And so we'll put out an email blast that gives a summary of what's going to be on the episode. Then we'll also on our social media platforms do the same thing. This is what we're talking about. Just a tagline to kind of get them interested, and then a link to our webpage. Okay, I'll save just a few more minutes for another question and answer thing, if there's any more questions at the end. But there's one more thing I want to cover before we're all the way done. And let's go to the last slide. No, I'm sorry.
This one?
Yep, next, sorry. So here's my timeline again, and I want to talk a little bit about this. This doesn't really have necessarily to do so much with the podcast. It does a little bit because you can put a podcast kind of into this category. But this is kind of more business ownership and entrepreneurship. I remember back in the day in 2010, sometime around there, when my dad and I bought that business, and that first year was really, really tough. We'd gone from, they had two brothers working full-time, one of their wives working full-time, and then a daughter that was working part-time. That first year, they were really old school. They had a DOS-based computer that they were still doing stuff on. So for that first year, we increased used technology, and were able to kind of improve some efficiencies so that for the first year, it was just me and one other employee. And about partway through that first year, we started to see some successes, and you could start to see a little bit of more money coming in. And I remember having a conversation with my dad about it'd be great if we could just get to the point where we each get another $2,000 a month. That's like a house payment. That's like getting your house for free. You're getting $2,000. And at that point, like, none of this other stuff was even in my peripheral vision. I wasn't even thinking of any of this stuff. My point is at this point, that $2,000, it's not an insignificant amount of money, but my vision was small. And over time, my vision has gotten way, way bigger. And one of the things that if I could give you a piece of advice outside of what I've done with the podcasting realm, it would be not to let your small vision be what limits your success and your ability to grow. Don't be afraid to think big. Over time, my vision has expanded, and I've seen that there's a lot of other possibilities. And a podcast can really do that. My vision it's been one of those things that just kind of constantly grows, and it's still growing. Look for other opportunities, look for other things, and allow your vision to grow so that you can think big. That's all. That's really all I've got. Any other questions? Anything I haven't answered that you'd like to have answered?
So Chris, when you purchased Motor Carrier HQ with your father back then, did the prior owners stay around as advisors at first for the first year, 6 months, 3 months? How did you work the transition of purchasing? Because obviously they had the clients that were used to them, and then you guys come in as the new ownership. How did that transition work out?
That's a great question. There was a transition period. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was based off of hours. I want to say it was like they had to give us 80 hours after we closed on it. Because the business, when we first bought it, all it did was fuel tax reporting and vehicle registrations. Registering a car is a pretty simple process. Registering a semi-truck is much more complicated. They actually pay registration fees for every state that they travel through. And so it's complicated. And so you usually don't want to do it on your own. And those are the only two services they offer. We expanded a ton since then, but I didn't know really anything about fuel tax reporting or vehicle registrations when we bought the business. And so they kind of stayed around to kind of help with that transition. And I think they gave us about 80 hours spread over about a 2 or 3 month period. And I think if I remember right, even before the 80 hours or whatever that was done, like, we were ready to be, like, I don't think we even used the full 80 hours. But that is it was valuable. The first 20 hours probably were really valuable, and then that kind of the value of each of those hours diminished as time went on. Any other questions? Go ahead.
How would you go about finding Craig 2.0 if you were
I can give you Craig's contact info. Craig actually went off on his own. And he even for the first year and a half that I was doing the podcast, that was his side gig. It's his full-time thing now. So he'd take clients. But I just listen to podcasts and listen for somebody that you think will mesh well with your personality. And obviously, like, if you're going to record something, I think you need to have somebody that's here locally. Like, I live in North Salt Lake, Craig's in Layton. And so it's not too hard for me to hop over to his recording studio and record. And I like being in the studio. The sound quality is a little bit better. It's a legit studio. Sound damping, even the only thing that we ever hear are the jets coming over.
How many episodes? You started out with 10. Is that a good number to have kind of pre-recorded?
I think 5 or 10. I don't think you necessarily have to have a full 10, but probably 5. And I'm not doing so good of a job at it anymore, but there were times when we'd actually record either 2 at the same time or try to kind of be ahead of the game. I haven't been ahead of the game for at least 9 months. So usually what happens, we launch our episodes on Wednesdays. We're always on Wednesdays. And we typically try to record by Monday, but there have been times we haven't recorded until Tuesday. And Craig he's a night owl, so it's not a big deal for him to stay up and do all the editing, get it ready to go.
So I know it's not all about me, but where I'm at, I am actually journaling something that's happening in my business in the thought that I want to turn it into a book one day and maybe do an Audible book. The reason I wanted to come here today is to consider having it out on podcast as I go along. So I don't know if you have any feedback on, did you ever consider doing a book and just putting it out there for your truck drivers to listen to? What's the benefit of the podcast versus?
I think to a great extent, the content's probably really similar. Like each podcast almost essentially could be like a chapter in a book, right? And then so that's a possibility. I think it probably depends more on what your end game is. Like I think a podcast, unless you can build a really big audience really fast, it's going to be harder to monetize. If you've got a good concept and a good book that you can take to a publisher and sell, I think that would be a little bit easier to monetize. So I think it probably depends more on what your end game is than anything else, because I think they're really similar.
Just so everyone knows, Susan Lane said at the mill at Salt Lake Community College, I'm happy to give a basic editing tutorial class for business owners to help with their video or audio files.
Just so you guys know. Sounds like a good Bagels and
One caveat, and this is again, I'm not trying to steer anybody in one direction or another. I think one thing that I see business owners not do super well is put a value on their time. And there is a value on a business owner's time. And so you have to look at, okay, is my time valuable enough that it's better for me to pay somebody to do the editing? Or like, especially if you're early on, it might not be. It might be better for you to spend the time, your time might not, it may, the cost of having somebody edit it might not be worth the time you save. And so you just have to think that through and decide what is better for you. Edit myself or pay somebody to edit it. Put a value on your time. Any other questions?
All right.
Thanks. That's good. If you're thinking about running a podcast, I think Chris said something that kind of resonated with me is focus on your existing customers. If you're not quite sure what to say or what you want to say, focus on your existing customers and start building them, building your credibility that way. I think that will help you push forward with new product and new ideas, and also, again, establish yourself as a subject matter expert. Chris also mentioned Goldman Sachs and the growth strategy. I'm just going to give a plug for Goldman Sachs. Almost 800 companies now have come through the program here in Utah. We're just starting or getting applications for cohort 26 that starts in January. So go to 10KSB, apply for that. And then last thing is September 25th here at the Miller Conference Center is the Peak Podcast Summit. So if you guys want more information, we've had some more questions about getting access to other resources. That'd be a good place to come and network and find out more about podcasts. So that's, again, the 25th of September. There's information on Eventbrite right now. So with that, again, thank you for attending. We will see you next month. That's a wrap. Yeah.